The dust devil twisted across the empty desert road like a ghost seeking vengeance, and Jake Morrison watched it from beneath the brim of his weathered hat. He had been riding for 3 days straight, his horse's hooves creating the only sound in the vast silence of the Arizona territory. The year was 1887, and this land still belonged more to the Apache and the rattlesnakes than to any white settlement. Jake was a man who preferred the company of his own shadow. At 32, he had seen enough of civilization to know it wasn't for him. His face bore the marks of too many bar fights and desert storms, and his pale blue eyes held secrets that would make most men uncomfortable. He worked as a tracker and guide when he needed money, but mostly he just drifted from one forgotten corner of the territory to another. The town of Salvation Creek appeared on the horizon like a mirage, its wooden buildings shimmering in the afternoon heat. Jake had heard of the place but never visited. It was one of those frontier settlements that sprung up wherever someone found silver or gold, attracting every type of desperate soul the West could produce. As he rode closer, he could see a crowd gathered in the town square, their voices carrying across the desert air. Jake's horse, a sturdy Mustang he called Prophet, seemed to sense something wrong. The animal's ears twitched nervously as they approached the edge of town. Jake dismounted and tied Prophet to a hitching post outside Murphy's saloon, then walked toward the commotion. The crowd surrounded a makeshift gallows that had been erected in the center of the square. 2 wooden nooses swayed gently in the desert breeze, and Jake's stomach tightened as he saw 2 young Apache women standing on the platform. They couldn't have been more than 18 and 20 years old, with long black hair and defiant dark eyes that refused to show fear even in the face of death. "What's the charge?" Jake asked a bearded man standing near him. "Murder," the man spat into the dirt. "Killed 3 prospectors up in Devil's Canyon. Found 'em scalped and butchered like animals. These savage sisters here were caught with the dead men's belongings." Jake studied the 2 women more carefully. The older one, tall and proud, kept her chin raised as if daring the crowd to do their worst. The younger one, smaller but equally fierce, whispered something in Apache to her sister. Neither looked like cold-blooded killers to Jake. But he had learned long ago that appearances could be deceiving. Sheriff Briggs, a heavy-set man with a star pinned to his vest, climbed onto the platform. He was sweating profusely despite the late afternoon hour, and his hands shook slightly as he unfolded a piece of paper. "By the authority vested in me by the territorial government," he announced in a voice that carried across the square, "these 2 Apache women, known as Running Deer and Silent Moon, are to be hanged by the neck until dead for the murder of Thomas Henderson, Billy Crane, and Marcus Webb." The crowd erupted in cheers and catcalls. Jake noticed several well-dressed men standing apart from the rabble, watching the proceedings with calculating eyes. One of them was clearly wealthy, wearing a fine suit despite the desert heat, with a gold watch chain glinting across his vest. Another man, thin and sharp-featured like a coyote, whispered something in the rich man's ear. "Any last words?" Sheriff Briggs asked the condemned women. The older sister, Running Deer, stepped forward. When she spoke, her English was clear and precise, tinged with only the slightest accent. "We did not kill these men. Someone wants us to die for crimes we did not commit. The truth will come out, and those responsible will face justice." "Apache justice ain't the same as white man's justice," someone shouted from the crowd, causing another wave of laughter. Sheriff Briggs moved toward the lever that would drop the platform. Jake found himself stepping forward before he had consciously decided to do so. "Hold on there, Sheriff," Jake called out, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. The crowd turned to look at him, and Jake suddenly found himself the center of attention. Sheriff Briggs paused, his hand hovering over the lever. "You got something to say, stranger?" Jake climbed onto a wooden crate so everyone could see him. "I do. Name's Jake Morrison, And I've been tracking in this territory for 15 years. I know Apache ways, and I know white man's ways, too. Something about this whole situation stinks worse than a dead skunk in July. What are you getting at, Morrison? The sheriff's voice carried a warning. I'm getting at the fact that Apache women don't scalp their victims, Jake said loudly enough for everyone to hear. That's not their way, and they sure as hell don't leave evidence lying around to get themselves caught. If these women killed those prospectors, they would have disappeared into the desert like smoke. No white man's posse would have found them. The well-dressed man in the expensive suit stepped forward. I'm Thomas Blackwood, Territorial Mining Commissioner. Are you suggesting we should take the word of a drifter over the evidence collected by our sheriff? Jake looked directly at Blackwood, noting the man's soft hands and the way he stood like someone accustomed to being obeyed. I'm suggesting that maybe someone should ask a few more questions before we start hanging people, like why those prospectors were up in Devil's Canyon in the first place. That's Apache burial ground, and everyone in the territory knows it. A murmur ran through the crowd. Devil's Canyon was indeed sacred Apache territory, avoided by most white settlers out of respect or fear. Those men had every right to prospect wherever they chose, Blackwood replied smoothly. This is American territory now, not Apache land. Maybe so, Jake said, but it still doesn't explain how 2 Apache women managed to overpower 3 armed prospectors, or why they stuck around long enough to get caught with the evidence. Sheriff Briggs was looking increasingly uncomfortable. Look, Morrison, I appreciate your concerns, but we've got witnesses who saw these women in the area. We've got the victims' belongings found in their possession. That's enough evidence for me. What witnesses? Jake pressed. Who saw them in Devil's Canyon? The sheriff glanced nervously at Blackwood before answering. Miguel Santos, the Mexican trader. He was passing through the canyon and saw smoke from the prospectors' camp, found the bodies the next morning. Jake knew Miguel Santos by reputation. The man was a trader who worked both sides of the border, not always legally. He was also known to be easily bought if the price was right. And where exactly did you find these women with the stolen goods? About 5 miles south of the canyon, camped by Willow Creek. Jake shook his head. That makes even less sense. If they killed those men in Devil's Canyon, why would they head south toward Salvation Creek instead of north toward the reservation? And why would they keep stolen goods that could identify them? The crowd was beginning to mutter among themselves, and Jake could see doubt creeping into some faces. But Blackwood wasn't about to let his carefully orchestrated execution fall apart. Perhaps this drifter has Apache sympathies, Blackwood suggested with a slight smile. Perhaps he's more concerned with protecting murderers than seeing justice done. The crowd's mood shifted again, and Jake could feel the hostility rising. In frontier towns like Salvation Creek, accusations of Indian sympathizing could be as dangerous as accusations of murder. I'm concerned with the truth, Jake replied evenly. And the truth is that this whole thing smells like a setup. Sheriff Briggs raised his hand for quiet. That's enough, Morrison. I've listened to your concerns, but the law is the law. These women had their trial, such as it was, and they were found guilty. The sentence will be carried out. As the sheriff moved toward the lever again, Jake made a decision that would change everything. He pulled his Colt .45 from its holster with lightning speed and pointed it directly at Sheriff Briggs. I said hold on, Jake said quietly, but his voice carried absolute authority. The crowd gasped and began backing away. Several men reached for their own weapons, but Jake's reputation as a gunfighter was well known in these parts. Nobody wanted to be the first to test him. You're making a big mistake, Morrison, Blackwood said, but Jake noticed a flicker of something that might have been fear in the man's eyes. Maybe so, Jake replied, but I've made bigger mistakes and lived to tell about them. Sheriff, I want you to cut those women down. Now. I can't do that, Morrison. You're interfering with legal proceedings. There's nothing legal about a lynch mob masquerading as justice, Jake said. Cut them down or I'll do it myself. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. Jake could hear his own heartbeat in the desert silence. Then, unexpectedly, one of the townspeople spoke up. "Maybe we should listen to him," said an elderly man Jake hadn't noticed before. Jake Morrison's word carries weight in these parts. If he says something's wrong, maybe we ought to pay attention. Other voices joined in, and Jake could see the crowd beginning to divide. Some still wanted blood, but others were having second thoughts. Sheriff Briggs looked desperately at Blackwood, who gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head. "All right, Morrison," the sheriff said finally. "But you're taking responsibility for these women. If they run, it's on your head, and if they kill again, their blood is on your hands." "I'll take that responsibility," Jake said without hesitation. As Sheriff Briggs reluctantly cut the ropes binding the two Apache women, Jake kept his gun trained on the crowd. Running Deer and Silent Moon stood proudly despite their ordeal, and the older sister gave Jake a look of gratitude mixed with suspicion. "This isn't over, Morrison," Blackwood said as the crowd began to disperse. "These women are guilty, and you're harboring criminals." "We'll see about that," Jake replied. He waited until most of the crowd had left before holstering his weapon and approaching the two sisters. "You speak English?" he asked Running Deer. "Yes," she replied cautiously. "You risked much for strangers." "Why?" Jake considered the question. Why had he gotten involved? He had spent years avoiding other people's problems, keeping to himself in the vast emptiness of the desert. But something about this situation had triggered every instinct he possessed. "Because I know a frame job when I see one," he said finally. "Those men didn't die the way Sheriff Briggs claims, and you two didn't kill them." Silent Moon spoke for the first time, her voice softer than her sister's, but equally determined. "How do you know this?" "Because I've seen real Apache work, and I've seen white men trying to make killings look like Apache work. What happened to those prospectors was the second kind." Running Deer studied Jake's face carefully, as if trying to read his soul. "You will help us prove our innocence?" "I'm going to try," Jake said. "But first, we need to get out of this town before Blackwood decides to organize a proper lynch mob. I've got a feeling that man doesn't give up easy." As if summoned by Jake's words, Blackwood appeared at the entrance to the saloon, flanked by two hard-looking men Jake hadn't seen before. They wore their guns low and ready, the mark of professional killers. "Looks like we're about to have company," Jake muttered. "Can you two ride?" "Like the wind," Running Deer replied. "Then we'd better start moving. Something tells me Salvation Creek is about to become very unhealthy for all three of us." The sun was beginning to set over the desert, painting the sky in shades of red and gold that reminded Jake of blood and fire. As he led the two Apache women toward the hitching post where Prophet waited, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just stepped into something much bigger and more dangerous than a simple case of frontier justice gone wrong. Behind them, he could hear Blackwood giving orders to his men, and Jake knew their time was running short. Whatever conspiracy had led to the deaths of 3 prospectors and the framing of 2 innocent women, it was clear that powerful people were determined to see it through to the end. But Jake Morrison had never been one to back down from a fight, especially when innocent lives hung in the balance. As he helped Running Deer and Silent Moon mount a pair of horses from the sheriff's own stable, he made a silent promise to himself and to them. Before this was over, the truth would come out, and those responsible for the murders and the cover-up would face real justice, not the corrupted version being dispensed in Salvation Creek. The desert night was calling, and with it, the beginning of a journey that would test everything Jake thought he knew about loyalty, justice, and the price of doing what was right in a land where might too often made right. The 3 riders moved through the desert night like shadows fleeing from a nightmare. Jake led the way on Prophet, while Running Deer and Silent Moon followed on the horses they had borrowed from the sheriff's stable. Behind them, the lights of Salvation Creek grew smaller until they disappeared entirely, swallowed by the vast darkness of the Arizona Territory. They rode hard for the first hour, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and any pursuit that might follow. Jake knew these desert trails better than most, and he led them along paths that would be difficult to track even in daylight. The moon was only a silver crescent, providing just enough light to avoid the worst hazards while keeping them hidden from searching eyes. When they finally stopped to rest near a cluster of ancient rock formations that the Apache called the Sleeping Giants, Jake could see that both women were exhausted but determined. They had ridden without complaint, despite having spent the day facing death, and he found himself impressed by their resilience. "We should be safe here until dawn," Jake said, dismounting and checking Prophet's legs for any signs of injury. "These rocks will hide us from anyone looking, and there's water nearby." Running Deer slid down from her horse with the fluid grace of someone who had been riding since childhood. "You saved our lives tonight, Jake Morrison, but you have made enemies of powerful men. Why did you choose to help us?" Jake unsaddled his horse and gave the animal a handful of grain from his saddlebags. "Because I recognize a setup when I see one, and because I've seen too much innocent blood spilled in the name of frontier justice." Silent Moon approached cautiously, her dark eyes studying Jake's face in the moonlight. "You said the killings were made to look like Apache work. How do you know this?" "Because real Apache warriors would never have left those bodies to be found so easily," Jake replied. "And they certainly wouldn't have scalped their victims in such a sloppy way. When Apache takes scalps, it's done with precision and meaning. What happened to those prospectors was butchery designed to inflame white settlers against your people." Running Deer nodded slowly. "This is what we tried to tell Sheriff Briggs, but he would not listen. Someone killed those men and made it appear we were responsible. The question is why," Jake said, settling against a large boulder and pulling out a piece of jerky. "What were those prospectors really doing in Devil's Canyon? And who benefits from having you two blamed for their deaths?" As they shared water and what little food Jake carried, Running Deer began to tell their story. She and Silent Moon were sisters from the White Mountain Apache Reservation, daughters of a respected medicine man named Gray Eagle. They had been traveling to visit relatives on the San Carlos Reservation when they were captured by a posse led by Sheriff Briggs. "We were camped by Willow Creek when they found us," Running Deer explained. "They said we had stolen goods from dead prospectors, but we knew nothing of any killings. The items they claimed were stolen were placed in our camp while we slept." "Someone wanted you to be found with that evidence," Jake mused, "which means this whole thing was planned well in advance." Silent Moon spoke up, her voice thoughtful. "There is something else. The night before we were captured, we saw riders moving through the desert. White men, traveling fast toward Devil's Canyon. We thought nothing of it then, but now—" "How many riders?" Jake asked, his interest sharpening. "4, maybe 5. They rode like men with urgent business." Jake filed this information away. If Silent Moon was right, then the real killers had been in the area just before the murders occurred, but proving it would be another matter entirely. As the night wore on, Jake found himself thinking about Thomas Blackwood and the way the man had orchestrated the near execution in Salvation Creek. The territorial mining commissioner had seemed awfully eager to see the two Apache women hanged, and his reaction when Jake interrupted the proceedings suggested more than just civic duty. "Tell me about Devil's Canyon," Jake said. "I know it's sacred Apache ground, but is there anything else special about it?" Running Deer exchanged a meaningful look with her sister before answering. "Our grandfather used to tell stories about that place. He said there were old mines there, dug by Spanish priests long before the white settlers came. Most Apache avoid the area because of the spirits that are said to guard the ancient treasures." "Treasures?" Jake's pulse quickened. "What kind of treasures?" "Silver, mostly. Maybe gold." The stories say the Spanish priests found rich veins of ore and worked them in secret, using Apache slave labor. When the priests were finally driven out, they sealed the mines and left maps hidden in the canyon walls. Jake whistled softly. If there was truth to these legends, it would explain a lot about what had happened to the three prospectors. Men had killed for far less than the location of Spanish silver mines. "Do you think those prospectors might have been looking for these old mines?" he asked. Silent Moon nodded. It would explain why they were in Devil's Canyon despite knowing it was forbidden territory. White men's greed often makes them forget their fear. As dawn approached, Jake made a decision that would prove crucial to uncovering the truth behind the murders. "I'm going back to Devil's Canyon," he announced. "If those prospectors found something there might be evidence left behind that could prove your innocence." "We will come with you," Running Deer said immediately. "No, it's too dangerous. Blackwood's men will be looking for you, and Devil's Canyon is the first place they'll search." "This is our land," Silent Moon replied firmly. "We know every rock and shadow in that canyon. You need our help to find what you seek." Jake studied their faces and saw the determination there. These women had already proven they were tougher than most men he knew, and their knowledge of the area could indeed be invaluable. "All right," he agreed reluctantly. "But we do this my way. No unnecessary risks, and if shooting starts, you get clear and head for the reservation. Understood?" Both women nodded, and Jake began planning their approach to Devil's Canyon. They would need to be careful, as Blackwood had surely sent men to search the area by now, but if they could find evidence of what the prospectors had really been doing there, it might be enough to expose the conspiracy that had nearly cost 2 innocent lives. They set out as the sun climbed over the eastern mountains, taking a roundabout route that would bring them to Devil's Canyon from an unexpected direction. Jake had decided to approach from the north, using a series of narrow arroyos that would provide cover from prying eyes. As they rode, Running Deer told Jake more about the legends surrounding the canyon. According to Apache oral tradition, Spanish missionaries had discovered rich silver deposits there in the 1600s and had forced local tribes to work the mines. The operation had continued for decades until a great Apache war chief named Thunderhorse had led a successful rebellion that drove the Spanish out forever. "The stories say Thunderhorse cursed the mines so that anyone who tried to steal the silver would meet a violent death," Running Deer explained. "Perhaps this curse fell upon the three prospectors." Jake didn't put much stock in curses, but he had learned to respect Apache wisdom. If there was danger in Devil's Canyon, it was more likely to come from living men than from supernatural forces. They reached the canyon's northern rim around midday, and Jake immediately saw that they were not alone. Smoke was rising from the canyon floor, and through his spyglass, he could see several men moving around what appeared to be a makeshift camp. "Blackwood's people," he muttered, handing the spyglass to Running Deer. She studied the scene below for several minutes before passing the instrument to her sister. "5 men," she reported. "They have equipment for digging. And look there, near the old rock fall. They have found something." Jake took back the spyglass and focused on the area Running Deer had indicated. Sure enough, the men below had exposed what looked like the mouth of a cave or tunnel. Tools and excavated rock were scattered around the entrance, and one of the men was emerging from the opening carrying what appeared to be a sample of ore. "Well, I'll be damned," Jake whispered. "Those prospectors did find the old Spanish mines." "And now Blackwood's men are working them," Silent Moon added. "But why kill the prospectors who made the discovery?" Jake thought about it for a moment. Then the answer came to him with crystal clarity. Because Blackwood wanted to claim the find for himself. The prospectors were working independently, which means they would have had legal claim to anything they discovered. But if they died under suspicious circumstances, especially if Apache were blamed for their deaths, their claims would be invalidated. Then Blackwood could file new claims in his own name. Running Deer concluded. And blame their deaths on savage Indians who wanted to protect their sacred ground. Exactly. It's the perfect cover story. Nobody would question a mining commissioner taking over claims from dead prospectors, especially if their deaths were attributed to Indian violence. Jake studied the scene below more carefully, memorizing the layout of Blackwood's operation. There had to be evidence down there that would prove the truth about what had happened to the original prospectors. But getting to it would not be easy with 5 armed men guarding the site. There's an old Apache trail that leads down into the canyon from the east side, Silent Moon said, as if reading his thoughts. It is very dangerous, but it would bring us near the mine without being seen. How dangerous? Jake asked. 2 summers ago, my cousin tried to use that trail to reach the canyon floor. His body was found 3 days later at the bottom of the cliff. Jake winced. Maybe we should think of another approach. My cousin had been drinking firewater, Running Deer added. A sober person with climbing experience could make the descent. Jake considered their options. A frontal approach was out of the question with 5 armed men below. They could wait for nightfall, but Blackwood's people might finish their work and leave by then. The dangerous eastern trail seemed to be their best option for getting close enough to gather evidence. All right, he decided, but I go down alone. If something happens to me, you 2 head straight for the reservation and tell your tribal leaders what you've learned. They'll know how to get word to the territorial authorities. We stay together, Running Deer said firmly. You saved our lives. We will not abandon you to face this danger alone. Jake started to argue, but he could see there was no point. These Apache women had already proven they were braver than most men, and their knowledge of the terrain could mean the difference between success and failure. They spent the next hour working their way around to the eastern side of Devil's Canyon, where Silent Moon showed them the beginning of the treacherous trail. It was indeed dangerous, little more than a series of handholds and narrow ledges carved into the canyon wall by generations of Apache feet. The key is to never look down, Running Deer advised as they prepared to begin the descent. Trust your hands and feet, not your eyes. Jake had done his share of rock climbing in his years as a tracker, but this trail tested every skill he possessed. The ancient handholds were worn smooth by wind and weather, and loose rocks threatened to give way under their weight. Several times he found himself pressed against the cliff face, breathing hard and wondering if he had finally bitten off more than he could chew. But Running Deer and Silent Moon moved down the trail with the confidence of mountain goats, and their example gave Jake the courage to continue. After what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, they reached a narrow ledge that overlooked the mining operation. From their new vantage point, they could see everything clearly. Blackwood's men had indeed discovered an old Spanish mine, and they were working frantically to extract silver ore from its depths. Equipment that must have cost thousands of dollars was scattered around the site, suggesting that this operation had been planned for months. More importantly, Jake could see evidence of the original prospectors' camp nearby. Personal belongings were still scattered around an old fire pit, and what looked like surveying equipment lay abandoned in the sand. There, Silent Moon whispered, pointing to a spot near the mine entrance. Do you see the fresh graves? Jake followed her gaze and spotted 3 mounds of earth that were obviously recent. The prospectors, he breathed. Blackwood had them killed and buried here, then moved their bodies to make it look like they died somewhere else. But how do we prove it? Running Deer asked. Jake was about to answer when one of the men below walked directly to the abandoned camp and began gathering up the surveying equipment. As he did, something fell from his pocket and glinted in the afternoon sunlight. Through his spyglass, Jake could see it was a silver medallion on a chain. Even from a distance, he could make out the distinctive design of an Apache Thunderbird. Son of a bitch, Jake muttered. That's how they planted the evidence on you. One of Blackwood's men posed as the killer, taking trophies from the victims to plant in your camp later. As they watched, the man picked up the fallen medallion and stuffed it back into his pocket. Then he called out to his companions, and Jake heard the words that would change everything. "Boss says to wrap this up by tonight. We're pulling out at first light, and this whole canyon is going to be our little secret." Jake realized they had stumbled onto something much bigger than a simple murder and frame-up. This was a carefully orchestrated conspiracy involving territorial officials, hired killers, and enough money to fund a major mining operation. But as he prepared to withdraw and plan their next move, a loose rock gave way under Silent Moon's foot. The sound echoed through the canyon like a gunshot, and suddenly 5 pairs of eyes were looking up at their hiding place. "Well, well," one of the men called out, reaching for his rifle. "Looks like we got ourselves some visitors." Jake knew they had perhaps 30 seconds before the shooting started. As he helped Running Deer and Silent Moon scramble for better cover, he realized that their mission to gather evidence had just become a fight for survival. The first bullet sparked off the rock wall inches from Jake's head, sending stone fragments flying like deadly hornets. He pushed Running Deer and Silent Moon deeper into the shallow cave they had found on the cliff face, then drew his Colt and returned fire at the men below. "Can we climb back up the trail?" he shouted over the gunfire. "Not with them shooting at us," Running Deer replied, checking the loads in her own pistol. Jake was surprised to see she was armed, but grateful for the extra firepower. Silent Moon was examining the back of the cave, running her hands along the rough stone walls. "There is another way," she called out. "This cave connects to the old mine tunnels. I can feel air moving through this crack in the rock." Jake risked a glance around the cave entrance and saw that Blackwood's men were spreading out, trying to find a way up to their position. One of them was climbing the treacherous eastern trail they had used, while the others were looking for alternative routes. "How do you know about the tunnel connection?" Jake asked as another volley of shots echoed through the canyon. "Apache children used to play in these caves before the spirits made them forbidden," Silent Moon explained, pushing against a section of wall that seemed different from the rest. "There are passages that lead all through the canyon." With a grinding sound of stone against stone, part of the wall shifted inward, revealing a narrow opening just large enough for a person to squeeze through. Cool air flowed out of the darkness beyond, carrying the scent of mineral deposits and something else Jake couldn't identify. "Where does it lead?" Running Deer asked, peering into the black tunnel. "If I remember correctly, it comes out near the bottom of the canyon behind the old Spanish altar," Silent Moon replied. "We could reach the mining camp without being seen." Jake made a quick decision. They couldn't stay pinned down in the cave forever, and going back up the cliff trail would be suicide with armed men waiting for them. The mysterious tunnel might be dangerous, but it offered their best chance of reaching evidence that could expose Blackwood's conspiracy. "All right, but I go first," Jake said, pulling out his oil lamp and striking a match. The small flame cast dancing shadows on the tunnel walls as he squeezed through the opening. The passage was even narrower than it had appeared from outside, forcing them to move single file through spaces barely wide enough for Jake's shoulders. The walls were rough-hewn stone, clearly the work of the Spanish miners who had carved these tunnels centuries ago. Strange symbols were etched into the rock at regular intervals, and Jake wondered if they were Spanish religious markings or something older. They had been crawling through the tunnel for perhaps 10 minutes when Jake heard voices echoing from somewhere ahead. He motioned for silence and extinguished his lamp, plunging them into absolute darkness. "Told you this was a bad idea, Pete," one voice was saying. "Morrison's got a reputation with that gun of his." "Blackwood's paying us good money to clean up this mess," another voice replied. "Besides, there's only 3 of them and 5 of us. How hard can it be?" Jake realized they were hearing Blackwood's men through another opening in the tunnel system. He felt along the wall until he found what seemed to be a wider space, then carefully relit his lamp with the flame turned down low. They were in a natural cavern that connected several tunnels, and one of those tunnels clearly led toward the voices. More importantly, Jake could see evidence of recent activity in the cavern. Modern tools were scattered around, along with what looked like surveying maps and sample bags of ore. "This must be where they've been planning their operation," Jake whispered to the two women. "Look at all this equipment." Running Deer picked up one of the maps and studied it by lamplight. "These markings show the entire canyon," she said. "And look here, they have marked the location where they buried the prospectors." Jake examined the map more closely and saw that she was right. Someone had carefully marked 3 X's in a location that was definitely not where the bodies had supposedly been found. This map was evidence that could blow Blackwood's conspiracy wide open. Silent Moon was examining some papers that had been left with the surveying equipment. "These are mining claims," she said, "all filed in Thomas Blackwood's name, dated 3 days after the prospectors were killed." "Son of a bitch didn't waste any time," Jake muttered. "He probably had these papers prepared before the murders even happened." The voices from the tunnel were getting closer, and Jake realized they needed to move quickly. He stuffed the maps and claim papers into his jacket, then led the way toward what he hoped was the tunnel that would take them to the canyon floor. This passage was wider and showed more evidence of Spanish construction. The walls were lined with fitted stones, and religious symbols were carved at regular intervals. Jake began to understand why the Apache considered this place sacred. The Spanish had built their mine like a cathedral, complete with carved altars and religious imagery. They emerged from the tunnel system behind a large boulder that had fallen from the canyon wall centuries ago. From their hiding place, they could see Blackwood's mining operation in full swing. 2 men were working at the mine entrance, while a third stood guard with a rifle. More importantly, Jake could see the fresh graves that Silent Moon had spotted earlier. They were located exactly where the stolen map had indicated, far from where the bodies had supposedly been discovered. "We need to document this somehow," Jake whispered. "Even with the maps and papers, people might not believe our word against Blackwood's." Running Deer smiled grimly and pulled out a small leather pouch. "Apache women are taught to make accurate drawings of everything we see," she said, producing charcoal and a piece of bark paper. "I can create a map that shows exactly where the bodies are buried." As Running Deer worked on her map, Jake studied the layout of the camp more carefully. The guard was positioned where he could watch the main approaches to the canyon, but the boulder they were hiding behind blocked his view of the grave sites. "I'm going to get closer," Jake decided. "If I can find something from the original campsite that connects to the evidence planted in your camp, it would strengthen our case even more." "Too dangerous," Silent Moon whispered. "That guard will see you the moment you move." Jake was about to argue when the decision was made for him. One of Blackwood's men came running into the camp from the direction of the cliff trail, shouting for his companions. "They got away," the man called out. "Found blood on the rocks, but no bodies. Morrison and those Apache women disappeared like smoke." The guard cursed and spat into the dirt. "Blackwood ain't gonna like this." He wanted them dead before they could cause any more trouble. "Maybe they fell down into the canyon somewhere," the first man suggested. "There's a lot of places to hide a body in these rocks." "We better find them," the guard replied grimly, "or Blackwood's gonna find replacements for all of us." Jake realized this was their chance. With the men distracted by the news of their escape, he might be able to reach the burial site without being seen. He moved carefully from boulder to boulder, using the natural cover of the canyon floor to stay hidden. Behind him, Running Deer continued working on her detailed map while Silent Moon kept watch. The first grave was approximately 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, clearly designed to hold a human body. The earth was still soft and dark, indicating recent digging. More importantly, Jake could see that someone had tried to remove evidence from the site, but had missed several important details. A piece of torn fabric was caught on a nearby thorny bush, and when Jake examined it closely, He recognized it as part of a shirt that didn't match anything the prospectors had been wearing when their bodies were supposedly discovered. This was clothing from the real murder site, proving that the men had been killed here and moved later. Even better, Jake found a brass button that had rolled under a nearby rock. It was engraved with the initials TH, which almost certainly stood for Thomas Henderson, one of the murdered prospectors. As Jake carefully collected these pieces of evidence, he heard footsteps approaching from behind. He turned to see one of Blackwood's men emerging from the mine tunnel, covered in dust and carrying a bag of ore samples. The man stopped when he saw Jake crouched by the grave sites. For a moment, neither moved, each trying to process what was happening. Then the man opened his mouth to shout a warning to his companions. Jake moved faster, tackling the man before he could make a sound. They rolled in the dirt, fighting for control of the situation. The man was strong and desperate, but Jake had experience in frontier brawls that gave him the advantage. The fight ended when Running Deer appeared behind the man and struck him across the head with a rock. He collapsed unconscious, and Jake quickly bound his hands with rope from his own gear. "We need to get out of here before his friends miss him," Jake said, but as he spoke, they heard voices calling from the mine entrance. "Charlie! Where'd you go? Charlie!" "Time to leave," Silent Moon said urgently. But as they prepared to retreat to the tunnel system, Jake heard something that made him freeze. New voices were approaching the canyon from the main trail, and one of them belonged to Thomas Blackwood himself. "I want this place cleaned up and abandoned by tonight," Blackwood was saying as he rode into the camp. "Morrison's caused enough trouble already, and I won't have him connecting this operation to the prospectors' deaths." Jake realized they had stumbled onto something far more valuable than evidence. They were about to witness Blackwood personally overseeing the cover-up of his crimes. Hidden behind the fallen boulder, the three companions watched as Blackwood dismounted and began giving orders to his men. He was accompanied by two riders Jake didn't recognize, but their expensive clothes and authoritative manner suggested they were territorial officials of some kind. "Senator Walsh, I assure you this situation is completely under control," Blackwood was saying to one of the newcomers. "The Apache women have been dealt with, and Morrison is just one man against the entire territorial authority structure." "Morrison has a reputation, Blackwood," the man called Walsh replied. "If he starts asking the wrong questions, this whole arrangement could unravel." Jake felt his blood run cold. Senator Walsh was a powerful figure in territorial politics, and his involvement suggested that Blackwood's conspiracy reached much higher than anyone had imagined. "What arrangement?" the third man asked, and Jake recognized him as Judge Hartwell from the territorial court. "The arrangement that allows us to develop these silver deposits without interference from federal Indian agents or competing mining interests," Blackwood explained patiently. "These old Spanish mines could make us all very wealthy men, but only if we maintain complete control over access to the canyon." "And if Morrison continues to interfere?" Judge Hartwell pressed. "Then Morrison will suffer an unfortunate accident while pursuing dangerous fugitives," Blackwood replied coldly. "The territorial newspapers will report that he died heroically trying to bring Apache murderers to justice." Jake exchanged glances with Running Deer and Silent Moon. They were witnessing the planning of his own murder, along with confirmation that powerful territorial officials were involved in the conspiracy from the beginning. But as they listened to more of the conversation, Jake realized the full scope of what they were dealing with. This wasn't just about one silver mine or 3 dead prospectors. Blackwood and his associates were planning to use Apache attacks as justification for seizing tribal lands throughout the territory. "Once we establish the precedent that Apache sacred sites are not protected from legitimate mining operations," Senator Walsh was explaining, "we can extend the same principle to other locations. The White Mountain Reservation alone contains mineral deposits worth millions of dollars. And every Apache attack on miners or prospectors strengthens our legal position," Judge Hartwell added. The federal government will eventually have to choose between protecting Apache religious sites and protecting American economic interests. Jake felt sick as he understood the implications. Blackwood's group wasn't just planning to steal one canyon. They were orchestrating a campaign to destroy Apache land rights throughout the territory, using manufactured evidence of savage attacks to justify government seizure of tribal property. Running Deer's face was set in stone as she listened to the conversation, but Jake could see tears of rage in her eyes. Silent Moon looked like she wanted to kill someone, and Jake couldn't blame her. But before they could decide what to do with this information, disaster struck. The unconscious man Jake had tied up began to regain consciousness, groaning softly as he came around. The sound carried clearly in the desert air, and Blackwood's head snapped up like a hunting dog catching a scent. "What was that?" he demanded. His men spread out, weapons ready, searching for the source of the noise. Jake knew they had perhaps 30 seconds before they would be discovered, and fighting their way out against 7 or 8 armed men would be suicide. But as he prepared to make a desperate run for the tunnel entrance, he heard something that changed everything. The distant sound of many horses approaching the canyon at a gallop. "Riders coming in fast from the south," one of Blackwood's men called out. Through his spyglass, Jake could see a large group of horsemen approaching the canyon. At their head rode Sheriff Briggs, but behind him came faces Jake recognized: federal marshals, territorial rangers, and what looked like a small detachment of cavalry soldiers. "How the hell did they find us?" Blackwood snarled. The answer came from an unexpected source. Miguel Santos, the Mexican trader who had supposedly witnessed the Apache attack, came running into the camp on foot, his horse having apparently given out during a hard ride. "Senor Blackwood," Santos called out. "The federales, they know everything. Someone told them about the mines, about the killings, about everything." Blackwood grabbed Santos by the shirt. "What do you mean, everything? Who talked?" "I do not know, but they have maps. They have papers. They know about the graves here in the canyon. They are coming to arrest everyone." Jake realized what had happened. Someone else had been investigating Blackwood's operation, and their evidence had finally reached the right authorities. The question was whether he and the 2 Apache women would live long enough to see justice done. As the federal officers rode into the canyon, Blackwood made a desperate decision. He pulled out his revolver and pointed it directly at Senator Walsh. "Nobody's going to prison," he snarled. "We're all going to walk out of this canyon, and these federal boys are going to forget they ever saw anything suspicious here." "Have you lost your mind?" Walsh demanded. "Maybe," Blackwood replied, "but I've got enough evidence hidden away to bring down half the territorial government if I go down. So we're all going to cooperate, or we're all going to hang together." The standoff that followed would determine not only the fate of Jake Morrison and the 2 Apache sisters, but the future of law and order in the entire Arizona territory. As federal marshals surrounded the canyon and called for Blackwood's surrender, Jake made his own decision. Rising from his hiding place behind the boulder, he stepped into the open with his hands raised. "Federal officers!" he shouted at the top of his lungs. "Jake Morrison here. I've got evidence of murder and conspiracy, and witnesses who can testify to everything." Blackwood spun toward Jake's voice, his face twisted with rage. "You meddling bastard!" he screamed, swinging his pistol toward Jake. But before he could fire, Running Deer appeared beside Jake, her own weapon trained on Blackwood. "The real murderers of the 3 prospectors are here," she called out in clear, carrying English. "We have proof of their crimes and their conspiracy to blame innocent Apache for white men's greed." The canyon erupted in gunfire as Blackwood's men tried to fight their way out against federal forces. But the conspiracy that had begun with 3 murders in a sacred canyon was finally ending, and justice was about to be served in the desert that had seen too much innocent blood. As the smoke cleared and the last shots echoed away among the ancient rocks, Jake Morrison found himself still standing, still breathing, and still committed to seeing that the truth would finally come to light in the Arizona Territory. The desert drifter who had saved 2 Apache sisters from the Hangman had done more than rescue innocent lives. He had exposed a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of territorial government and prevented the theft of an entire people's homeland. But most importantly, he had proven that sometimes one person willing to stand up for what's right can make all the difference between justice and injustice, between truth and lies, between hope and despair in the vast, unforgiving landscape of the American frontier.